Hello and welcome. I just recently uploaded my 2019 sort of reading plan for fiction, so I thought I would do a quick video about my reading plan for nonfiction. If you didn't catch the previous video, I do better. I have a richer reading experience, I think, whenever I do some sort of plan, some sort of structure to my reading. So for the past few years, I've actually done a priority reading list, which is specific books that I intend to prioritize reading through the year. This year, I've decided to be a little more flexible and a little more general, but I have given some thought to some types of books that I would like to read in nonfiction for 2019. So I thought I would just go through some of the selections. So let's just hop right into it. The first one is called 1947, Where Now Begins. This is by Elisabeth Åsbrink, and I heard about this book recently, and so it just jumped out at me that it was going to be a must-read for me because it sounds so super interesting. I'll just call up the blurb for it real quick. The year 1947 marks a turning point in the 20th century. Peace with Germany becomes a tool to fortify the West against the threats of the Cold War. The CIA is created. Israel is about to be born. Simone de Beauvoir experiences the love of her life, and ill George Orwell is writing his last book, and Christian Dior creates the hyper-feminine new look as women are forced out of jobs and back into the home. In the midst of it all, a 10-year-old Hungarian Jewish boy resides in a refugee camp for children of parents murdered by the Nazis. This year, he has to make the decision of a lifetime, one that will determine his own fate and that of his daughter, yet to be born, Elisabeth, which I'm assuming is the author here. So this one sounds really interesting, so I'll hope to get this one read in 2019. The next one, I would love to finish out this trilogy of the History of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans. I read the first volume of The Coming of the Third Reich earlier this year, and I did chat that, which I will link to below. But the other two volumes, the second one's called The Third Reich in Power, and the third one's called The Third Reich at War. So I would like to get both of these read this year. I have my fingers crossed that I can get to both of these this year. Then, I have a history. I love the history of the Bronze Age. So, the Bronze Age, for my reading for the Bronze Age for 2019, I think I'm going to try to get Empires of the Silk Road read. This is by Christopher I. Beckwith, A History of Central Asia from the Bronze Age to the Present. I've had this book for a while. I picked this up at a used book sale a while back and I haven't gotten it read yet, but I hope 2019 will be my year to do so. Then I have, I love Mediterranean history, the history of the Mediterranean region. And so I hope to get to Sea of Faith, Islam and Christianity in the Medieval Mediterranean World by Stephen O'Shea. I actually had intended to read this in 2018, but did not get to it. So I hope to get to this in 2019 because I do love this. History of religions is another big interest of mine, and then this concerns the history of these two religions across the Mediterranean. So I just think it'll be fascinating, so I hope to get to that. Then I have this one on my radar, Rome and Jerusalem, The Clash of Ancient Civilizations by Martin Goodman. This concerns Rome and its conflict with the Jews of around the year 70. There was a rebellion, a Jewish revolt against the Romans, and ultimately Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. This was in the year around, I think it's 70 AD. So this is a history of that conflict and its resonance supposedly still today. So it sounds super interesting to me. So I can't wait to get to that in 2019, I hope. Then I have this one, Lost Christianities. Sort of a history of religion, I like this sort of thing. Lost Christianities, The Battles for Scripture and the Faiths We Never Knew by Bart D. Ehrman, and I have a blurb for this one, just to read what the blurb says here. In Lost Christianities, Bart D. Ehrman offers a fascinating look at these early forms of Christianity and shows how they came to be suppressed, reformed, or forgotten. All of these groups insisted that they upheld the teachings of Jesus and his apostles, and they all possessed writings that bore out their claims, books reputedly produced by Jesus' own followers. Some groups of Christians claimed that their there was not one God, but 2 or 12 or 30. Some believed that the world had not been created by God, but by a lesser ignorant deity. Certain sects maintained that Jesus was human but not divine, while others said he was divine but not human. So, this early sort of tumult of early Christianity, I think it's really fascinating. So I'm hoping to get to this in 2019 as well. So then I have just a general history. I wanted to read something by Svetlana Alexievich, and I hope I pronounced that sort of right. But yeah, she is from Russia, and I think she won the Nobel Prize for Literature back in 2015. She writes really personal histories, my understanding is. So I chose Secondhand Time. Well, I haven't chosen it, but I'm thinking I will read Secondhand Time, The Last of the Soviets, and Oral History, because I've heard really super good things about this. So I would like to read something by Svetlana Alexievich. If anybody has a suggestion other than Secondhand Time, then leave me a comment down below. Places. I'm always interested sort of in places and sacred spaces especially, so I'm definitely going to try to get to Delphi, History of the Center of the Ancient World. This is another book that I had on my 2018 reading list and did not get to this year, so I do hope to get to this in 2019. Because I just find this period, ancient Greece, with the famous Oracle of Delphi, I think that this is it was a center of sacred, a sacred space for thousands of years. So I just think it's fascinating. All right, so then, I have this interest also in cities. So I've had this book I've owned this book for quite a while and I've never read it. It's called A City of the Century, The Epic of Chicago and the Making of America. This was a companion edition to the American Experience documentary series on PBS, which I did not see, but I think the book would be fascinating, and I think Chicago's a really interesting city, how it can come from basically nothing and not existing, and then in about 100 years or so become this booming major city. So I think it's would be a fascinating read. Then I have a book called Imaginary Cities here. Imaginary Cities by Darran Anderson. I have a blurb for this, so let me pull up the blurb because I think it would be really kind of interesting to read what it's about. Darran Anderson's wonderful book-length meditation on the idea of city in art, literature, and human hopes and fears. It is as fascinating as the cities he writes about. Cities that human beings imagined or hoped existed, that emerged from dreams, from aspirations, and sometimes from dread. So, Imaginary Cities by Darran Anderson. I do hope to get to this. I love, I'm into this sort of idea of cities recently, so I think it would be kind of cool. Then I also have this one, The City in History by Lewis Mumford. This is an academic work back of city planning, the history of cities, really, starting in the medieval era all the way to the time. I think this was the early 60s this was published. So, very influential in urban planning and whatnot. So I thought I would give it a read and just see what it's all about, since I've heard about it and I see it referenced periodically in articles about cities and whatnot. So, yeah. The City in History. So then, for philosophy, so I like to try to get some philosophy works in every year, or philosophical works in some form or another. So this one might be a challenge. This one's called Bubbles. It's the Spheres trilogy. So this is the first one, called Bubbles. This is by Peter Sloterdijk, and I hope I pronounced that sort of right as well. Bubbles. So let me read that. I have a blurb for it. This one might be a challenge for me, so we will see. But it says, exploring macro and micro space from the Greek agora to the contemporary urban apartment, Sloterdijk is able to synthesize with immense erudition the spatial theories of Aristotle, René Descartes, Gaston Bachelard, Walter Benjamin, and Georges Bataille into a morphology of shared or multipolar dwelling. This kind of caught my attention. Gaston Bachelard, I read The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard a couple of years ago and thought it was just wonderful and beautiful in its own way. And so Gaston Bachelard, if it's anything related to that, I think I'm going to like it. But it does sound kind of challenging, like it's going to be a challenging read. I'm not sure I think this was originally published in German. I'm not sure if the other two volumes have been published in English, but I do hope to get to Spheres in 2019 at least. So yeah, philosophy. Then I have this one, American Philosophy, A Love Story by John Tagg. I've had this one on my reading radar for quite some time, and I just never have seemed to have gotten to it, but I have kind of vowed that 2019 I'm going to get to this one eventually. It's the blurb here, let me see. Part intellectual history, part memoir, American philosophy is ultimately about love, freedom, and the role that wisdom can play in turning one's life around. So this one got talked about by Mark over at Richardson Reads, and it sounded really like up my alley, and so I do hope to get to this in 2019. Okay, so where am I? American philosophy. So then I'm going to read, hope to get to The Philosophy of Civilization by Albert Schweitzer. I've actually been nibbling at this in bits and pieces, and I really need to dive in and give this a thorough read and chat it and everything, do the whole 9 yards. So I do hope to get to Albert Schweitzer's The Philosophy of Civilization. All right, so then ethics. I like to read on ethics too periodically. So speaking of Albert Schweitzer, I have another one, A Treasury of Albert Schweitzer, edited by Thomas Kiernan. I think Albert Schweitzer, I haven't read a lot of him yet, but what I have read I really love, and he was just a great humanitarian, and everything I've picked up of his so far I just think is phenomenal. So can't wait to get to that. Then I had this book called The Least of All Possible Evils, Humanitarian Violence from Arendt to Gaza by Eyal Weizman. It's The Least of All Possible Evils. I think this is interesting ethically. This is about humanitarian violence. So it's the lesser violence. It's using violence towards a supposedly humanitarian end. So I'm really kind of curious what this author has to say about that subject, because I think that's kind of a fascinating subject. All right, so then living a good life. So I'm always kind of also concerned about reading stuff that's just what's even fiction or nonfiction, about what it means to have a good life and to be living a good life. So I have this book, Me, Myself, and Us, The Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being by Brian R. Little. I've had this book for a while, but I've never read it. So this is The Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being. I don't know a lot other than that about it. Are you hardwired for happiness or born to brood? Do you think you're in charge of your future, or do you surf the waves of unknowable fate? Would you be happier or just less socially adept if you were less concerned about what other people thought about you? And what about your type A spouse? Is he or she destined to have a heart attack or just drive you to drink? So this is all about like personality, I think, how it's formed, how we become like who we are. So I think that's an interesting topic. So hoping to get to that. Then I have this book that was recommended by a friend of mine, The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom by Jonathan Haidt. I have never read anything by Jonathan Haidt, but she has, and she liked it, so she recommended it to me and thought I would like it, so I am going to give this a whirl. Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom does sound right up my alley, so I'm going to hope to get to that in 2019 as well. Then I have Creating Minds, An Anatomy of Creativity, seen through the lives of Freud, Einstein, Picasso, Stravinsky, Eliot, Graham, and Gandhi by Howard Gardner. This is an exploration of these famous people, these famous creative people, and just sort of their characteristics and maybe what made them so creative. So I think this might be sort of a fascinating read, so I kind of hope to get to that in 2019 as well. Finally, essays. So, I really want to try to incorporate more essays into my life. I would love to get to this year, The Proper Study of Mankind by Isaiah Berlin. From what I've read, this is Isaiah Berlin. I've never read anything by Isaiah Berlin, but apparently he was just a phenomenal intellect of the 20th century. It says here, The Proper Study of Mankind shows the full range of Berlin's work and breadth of his interests. In the originality of Machiavelli. After summing up what others have thought of the author of The Prince, Berlin launches into his own thoughts analysis, concluding that Machiavelli's most significant contribution to philosophy was, quote, his de facto recognitions that ends ultimately equally sacred may contradict each other, that entire systems of value may come into collision without possibility of rational arbitration, and that this happens not merely in exceptional circumstances as a result of abnormality or accident or error, but as a part of normal human situations. So a little more complicated than ends justify the means. But I think it's just going to be fascinating. Other treats to be found in this collection include the autobiographical conversations with Akhmatova and Pasternak, and what might be considered intellectual profiles of Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So yeah, I think this is about 17 of his kind of more widely known essays. So looking forward to that. If I can get to that in 2019, I will be happy. Then finally, the Shahnameh, books about books. I'm hoping to read lots of books about books in 2019, but one I have in mind is the Shahnameh, the Persian Epic as World Literature by Hamid Dabashi. This is just being published this year, or next month, January of 2019. So it is going to be a new release, but I am interested in learning more about the Shahnameh, and this book about a book is one that I do hope to get to in 2019. So that's sort of what my nonfiction plan loosely is looking like. It is subject to alter a bit here and there through the course of 2019, but I do sort of hope to stick to that structure. So, that's sort of my fiction reading planet. My fiction reading video is in a separate video, so check that out if you haven't seen it. And check in back with me through the 2019 reading year, and there will be lots coming up. So stay tuned. Take care. Bye.